Daniel chapter 7 is the end of the Aramaic section of Daniel, the bit that's written in Aramaic. But it's also the beginning of the apocalyptic section of the book of Daniel. Apocalyptic writing is maybe unusual to us. It uses all sorts of imagery. It describes things as extremely dramatic. It describes in ways that sound like it's the end of the world, but the reality on the ground is it's the falling of a kingdom or a nation. It's using all this kind of language, bringing it together. And so I'm going to read through Daniel chapter 7 so that you've got it in the back of your minds as you're doing this study. As we go through, you will notice that there's lots of different annotations all along either side, which if you want to, you can pause the video or rewind and have a look at those for extra reading, to go further, to sort of think further. But let's get straight into it, and hopefully this is helpful for you. Okay, it's the NIV translation. Different ones are good for different things. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying in bed, and he wrote down the substance of his dream. And this is it. Daniel said, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven churning up the great sea. Four great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. The sea was often depicted by prophets as the realm of the Gentiles, where the Gentiles came from in order to attack Israel. They often came out of the Mediterranean Sea, literally, in order to attack Israel. So, and this is probably God's presence, the work of his spirit, wind in some fashion, is churning up, causing the Gentiles to react to God's kingdom in different ways. The first beast was like a lion, predicted by Hosea and other prophets. The first was like a lion. It had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind or heart of a human was given to it. This is probably describing the conversion of Nebuchadnezzar, leader of Babylon, and in some way the conversion of Babylon at that period of time. He ordered that everyone worship Yahweh. This thing that was hunched over is now elevated and lifted up to become more human. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear, still standing upright, but a bit more beastly. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, "Get up and eat your fill of flesh." The Medo-Persian Empire had been brought in by God to devour the sinful Babylonian Empire under the reign of Belshazzar, to eat them up, and then the Persian side of the Medo-Persian Empire became a lot more powerful. After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard. Leopards move extremely fast in the Bible, and on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. Alexander the Great's kingdom, the Greeks, spread over the known world faster than almost anyone, and then split into 4 after Alexander the Great died. Notice that these beasts are slowly becoming less upright, and they are becoming more divided. They are becoming less human, and they're becoming more split apart, divided in their ways. And then this final one. After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth like the iron feet from Daniel chapter 2, that statue that we saw in Daniel chapter 2. Had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. Similar language that Jesus used when he describes the sower sowing the seed and what happens to some of the seed. Underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts. Different. This might describe a sort of a spiritual nature to this one that is different from the earthly nature, perhaps. And it had 10 horns. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a human being, and a mouth that spoke boastfully. This is emphasized as probably the worst crime of this horn is its speech. As I looked, so almost starting again, cutscene, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. We've now moved from earthly realities to heaven, and seeing a scene from heaven. And the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. We can probably understand this to be God the Father, understanding it from a Trinitarian perspective. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. This one is worthy of complete honor and reverence. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. This is the mobile throne that we've seen in Ezekiel, is now in Daniel's vision as well. Thank goodness, because otherwise Daniel wouldn't have been able to access God if God's throne was limited to just being in Israel, but God's throne, God's presence can be anywhere in this world. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him, purifying, able to purify the world from all evil and sin. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The courts were seated and the books were opened. The Gentile nations like to think that whatever they do will not be noticed by God. And it turns out that God has kept a record of everything that everyone has ever done ever. Nothing has passed him by. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into blazing fire. It all happens, feels like it's going on forever, but this judgment happens almost in an instant. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. It's an unusual thing, thinking historically, but the New Testament was written in Greek, which I find quite interesting. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. When you hear that phrase, a son of man coming in the clouds of heaven, with the clouds of heaven, notice which direction he is going. He is not coming down to the earth, he is coming to the Ancient of Days. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Jesus used the term, I am the Son of Man, more than any other. It crops up about 80 times across the Gospels. I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind disturbed me. I approached one of those standing there and asked him the meaning of all of this, or the certainty of all of this. So he told me and gave me the interpretation of these things. The 4 great beasts are 4 kings that will rise from the earth, but the holy people of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. He wants to drill that into our minds. Then I wanted to know the certainty or meaning of the 4th beast, which was different from all the others and most terrifying, with its iron teeth and bronze claws. That word bronze, apparently in the Aramaic, sounds a lot like the word for serpent. The beast that crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on its head, and about the other horn that came up before which 3 of them fell. The horn that looked more imposing than the others, and that had eyes and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I watched, this horn was waging war against the holy people and defeating them. Daniel is seeing in the future God's people experiencing this feeling of being under threat and feeling like they are losing this fight, and actually this thing is going away from them, that we're completely under fire and we've lost this one. Until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favour of the holy people of the Most High, those who've remained faithful to him and kept on persevering. Judgment will be in their favour. And the time came when they possessed the kingdom. He gave me this explanation. The 4th beast is a 4th kingdom that will appear on earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. The 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. After them another king will arise, different from the earlier ones. He will subdue 3 kings. He will speak against the Most High and oppress his holy people, and try to change the set times and the laws. Essentially setting up a false, different worship system. The holy people will be delivered into his hands for a time, times, and half a time, 3.5. Which is a representation of persecution. It was the time that Ahab persecuted God's people. It was the period of time that Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who we'll hear about possibly later in this series, he persecuted the Jews. It was also the time that Satan was allowed to persecute Job for in the Old Testament, and it's also half a Sabbath, half of 7, which is a very important number that will come up later in Daniel. But here's the most important bit. But the court will sit, judgment will happen, and his power, this little horn and the whole beastly everything, will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. I expected that to say to be handed over to God and the Son of Man, but the incredible nature of God that he shares everything that he wins with his people. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him. This is the end of the matter. Full stop. I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts, and my face turned pale, but I kept the matter to myself. I think Daniel's so disturbed because, yes, he sees this victorious reality, but he also sees his fellow people, God's people, being persecuted and suffering in awful ways. Daniel was old at this point. He could have thought, oh, this is someone else's issue later in the future. But he doesn't. He says, no, this is my issue as well. And I think this should stir us to pray for our persecuted brothers and sisters all around the world. Because we never know also the fact when we might face persecution in the future, and we will rely on them and their prayers as well. But we're in this together. So on Friday, we'll be praying for the persecuted church on Freedom Friday at 7 o'clock. We'd really encourage you to be there with us. I hope this has been vaguely helpful. You can rewind, have a look at different bits, and I really hope that you enjoy this study together. See ya.